Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Heidi, for that kind introduction. My name is, Christian Mendez Aguirre. I'm a scholar with PT 2050 at the School of Architecture. Welcome to our panel, Pivoting Towards Clarity, Conversation and Researching with Communities. And the 4 projects that we have represented in our panel are really like long-term efforts to create rigorous interdisciplinary research with communities. And they're pretty complex projects and partnerships. And so the format that I proposed for us to do this is that each panelist would basically introduce themselves and the project that they're working on, along with some project updates. And then I would come back and offer some framing for the discussion, especially clarifying the pivot piece. And so basically, you're about to hear like a lot of information about each of these projects that is pretty timed, and then we'll move into more of like a moderated discussion with prepared questions. So if you hear things that you're curious about, find us after the panel, or you can ask questions towards the end. But to use a term that one of my former co-advisors from Planet Texas 2050, Heather Hauser, put forward, don't release yourself if you feel infowhelmed by the information you're about to get. Just like embrace it and go with the flow. I'm going to, Catherine Lieberknecht will introduce the first project.
So funny, I was just setting my timer. Please, if I don't hit my time, pull me off.
Great.
And I accidentally set it to 12 minutes instead of 5. So already we're behind. So we'll do 4:30, and then hopefully it'll keep me going, because Christian is completely right. These are all, I've been seeing this all day with the lights right here. Maybe I'll move a little bit.
Come up there, or do you want us to talk from here?
I was going to sit.
Yeah.
Can we sit?
Yeah.
Okay.
It'll be faster.
Yeah, I think it's more of a conversation, too.
Great. That's perfect.
I'm going to stay here.
Does that work? Okay, great.
Yeah, and I'm going to give you this so you can move your slides.
Oh, thank you.
There we go.
Okay, all right, we've readjusted. That is so good. I am blinded. All right, if everyone can hear me for the recording, okay, great. Thank you, guys. Thanks for being here, 3:30. Woo! My kids will know I always get Diet Dr. Pepper on our road trips, so I feel like I'm settling in for our road trip. So I'm excited for this conversation. We're gonna be disciplined about keeping it on time, so we have lots of time for conversation. Thank you for your facilitation.
Yeah.
So I'm Catherine Lieberknecht, and I'm an associate professor in Community Regional Planning Program, which is in the School of Architecture. And I'm going to give a really brief overview of this very complex long-term project, but it's a fascinating project. So I think even just talking about it for a few minutes will give you a sense of what we're trying to accomplish. So the project I'm about to speak about is kind of a nested piece of this broader long-term Planet Texas 2050 funded research flagship project called Equitable and Regenerative Cities. And I co-lead that along with Fernanda Leche, who's a professor in civil, environmental, and architectural engineering. I think I messed that up a little bit, but you guys know what I mean. Civil, architectural, environmental engineering, and is also interim vice president for research right now. So she's a busy lady. We've worked on various pieces of this project over the years in Central Texas and Austin, and then for the past 3 years, we've been working in Southeast Texas, in Beaumont and Port Arthur, and kind of the 5 counties surrounding that area. And that's the piece I'm going to talk about very briefly, 3 minutes. So here's a kind of multiple snapshots of some of this project and the work we're looking to do. So this piece of ERC, our flagship project, is embedded within this larger Department of Energy funded urban integrated field laboratory project, which Patrick mentioned earlier and other people have talked about, and many people in this room are involved with in amazing interdisciplinary ways. But the idea behind this project, this is kind of the project area we're looking at, this 5-county area around Beaumont and Port Arthur. The piece of it that I'm leading, and it's almost past tense because we're actually wrapping up this project, which we'll talk about later on a little bit unhappily, I guess, earlier than planned. But I lead the piece that we're calling the co-design theme of this project, where I'm working with community leaders and with kind of what we're calling technical professionals, so kind of like the Mark Couders of Beaumont and Port Arthur, the people kind of working on climate adaptation or flood mitigation, flood managers, to better understand kind of the local experience, lived experience, and then combine it with these giant environmental science data sets, just like Pavel was talking about, the air quality data, the flooding data that Paolo Pasalacqua, who's the PI of this overall 60-person project, is working on. So combine those two pieces of data together to come up with locally informed climate adaptation strategies to address kind of the chronic stressors of air quality issues, air pollution, in an area that's very industrialized, as well as kind of the flood risk. I'm checking my time, Christian. Okay, a minute and a half. The other couple things I'll mention here, and I picked these images on purpose. The first is, is anyone here from this particular area for Beaumont, Port Arthur? Someone here is probably from the Houston area, so not quite in the same area. No Houstonians, wow. So, if you guys have driven through this area, it is incredibly ecologically rich. It's culturally rich. The communities are really tightly woven and really committed to staying in place. It's not an easy place to live all the time, right? It also has massive scale of industry. It's the way I described it to my kids the first time I went to visit. It was almost like being on a Star Wars movie set. Just the scale of the refineries is kind of unbelievable if you haven't been there in person to see it. And they're juxtaposed next to residents, to neighborhoods, to schools, to playgrounds. So those are the challenges we're working on together, community members, with this bigger 60-person team. And to wrap up, I'm supposed to wrap up about where we are now. After about kind of 3 years of collaboration, working with this task force structure, which I'll talk about later on, that we kind of adopted to do this community engaged research at scale, at a regional scale, embedded in this big kind of environmentally science-driven, federally funded research project. After the 3 years, we've worked with community members to pick multiple sites within this larger region to use as pilot areas. I did it 4:30, so 30 seconds. And we've managed to pick some pilot location sites to kind of co-design together some of these flooding and air quality strategies. We've narrowed down to kind of a portfolio of strategies that local community leaders and technical professionals feel that are appropriate, that are implementable, that are useful for the area. And then we've done some initial design work working with students at Texas A&M for some of these kind of flood-related designs. So that's a quick update of this project. Excellent. Yeah. There you go.
Great. Hi. I'm Maggie Hansen. I teach at the School of Architecture as well in the landscape architecture and urban design programs. And I am reporting on the Frontline Community Partnerships for Climate Action project, which I joined in 2024 and is co-led by myself and Carmen Valdez, who's a professor in public health at UT San Antonio, and Miriam Solis, who's an associate professor here in the community and regional planning programs. And this project, here we go. This project is centered on amplifying the voices of youth in frontline communities, first in Austin and more recently in the Rio Grande Valley. And working through arts-based and participatory methods using surveys, photo voice, storytelling, walks, and other creative actions to collect their priorities about the environment and understand better their relationships to their environment. This is focused on extreme heat, pollution, flooding, incidents of lacks of investment in basic infrastructure in communities. And it also focuses on a coalition-based model where we're working in dialogue through regular meetings with municipal leaders, youth, nonprofit leaders, as well as residents to think strategically about our next actions. I joined as part of an effort to develop ideas of design actions that were in support of these priorities. And in the, as an update, we are kind of in a moment of growing our project. So some of the coalition-based work has really created a foundation for us to support those relationships and those conversations. And now we're focused on three interwoven streams of work. One is interviews that document and better understand the impacts of extreme heat, especially in relation to mental health for youth and workers in the area. The next is an oral history and archival project in partnership with Arise at Alente, which is a nonprofit in the area. We're understanding the history of environmental change in Las Milpas, which is a part of South Far, a border town, and Arise at Alente's work on advocacy to support the community there. That's something that was supported by Monument Lab, which is a one-year fellowship based on public history projects. And then we're also doing planning and design work. Miriam Solis and I are kind of handing projects back and forth across our practicum and studio projects to do design visioning and planning efforts that are aligned with youth-identified priorities. So these all kind of support one another through research and scholarly outputs, and then continue to build those conversations with municipal leaders to impact change locally there. Great. Yay.
My name is Francisco Guajardo. I am the CEO of the Museum of South Texas History, and I think in the year 2020 is when I got the first email. I got an email from the quarterback. She may actually win the Heisman Trophy next year. This is Suzanne Pierce. She seems to have descriptors attached to her name that I've heard during the course of the day, spearheaded and this and that, so I'm going to add quarterback to that. Suzanne Pierce has extraordinary skills of bringing people together, and she's done that at least, with the example of the Museum of South Texas History. So that first email that I got from an old friend of mine who's a faculty member at UT RGV was about this piece of work that was happening at UT that they were calling Planet Texas. And as an alum of this institution and somebody who graduated from here 40 years ago or so, and who has, I think, bemoaned the fact that this institution has not been present in the Valley in ways that I thought it should, this was actually good news to me. So what we started with was a small grant to be able to deal with the issue of disaster mitigation. And so we organized a series of workshops, and this was actually right in the middle of the pandemic. So the workshops had to be virtual. But one of the first people that we brought on to a Sunday speaker series was Gordon Wells. And so he spoke on floods and preparedness, and we brought on Clint Dawson, and he spoke on hurricanes, and we focused on Beulah at that time. So it was Clint with several Hurricane Beulah survivors. And so it was storytelling that was actually quite fascinating, that then Clint would bring in his storm surge modeling to be able to provide texture to the stories. It was actually quite exciting. And then Clint was followed by Will Mobley, and so his name has been referenced here. So hazard mitigation, was his thing. And then it was like this list of luminaries that Suzanne was bringing in to, and we recorded everything, and everything is online. And so, anybody can go and see the interviews, the testimonials, and the very rich data. We then happened to, and so I'm going to leave Catherine to the end. Catherine, I'm going to speak about you because there's a purpose for leaving Catherine Brown toward the tail end. But then, and we actually tapped several sources for this, including not only Planet Texas resources, but also Water Development Board resources. And this is how Carrie Stevens came. And Carrie brought her graduate student, Nancy Carlson, who actually is from the Valley. And so what we did with them was a series of communications workshops around disaster mitigation and around flooding. And we had one workshop that was actually quite memorable because it is a workshop where Carrie and Nancy and then other folks like from the county and from the city municipalities taught people how to put together sandbags. And then how to use sandbags. Very simple stuff that to this day, when people stop me at HEB, they stop me to thank me for that workshop that they went to on how to construct and then use sandbags. It's a very simple thing. But not only the sandbags, but it was also literature that Nancy and Carrie and team produced that was actually quite useful to the community, both in English and in Spanish. So thank you for that. That was, I think, a high impact moment, and it was kind of an elongated moment, as it turns out. When Suzanne brought Catherine Brown, who's an infectious disease specialist, Catherine almost immediately partnered with a local scientist, Patti Feria from UTRGV, a biologist, also a specialist of vector-borne diseases. And so the thing about that relationship and bringing Patti into the fold was that Patti is now the latest of the PIs on the next grant that we're working. So we got a big NASA grant. Oh, okay. So the big NASA grant is really following a story that we've been cultivating at the museum. And so the story that we've been cultivating at the museum is a story of how the Underground Railroad ran through South Texas and into Mexico. When Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, if you were an enslaved person in the state of Texas, you weren't going to go up to the Mason-Dixon line, you were going to go to the Rio Grande. And so we have two families, the Jacksons and the Webbers, down in the valley that served as outposts on the Underground Railroad. And so those families have been part of our data collection during the last maybe 5-6 years. And so what we're doing with this NASA grant is that we are installing sensors on the properties that were the outposts on the Underground Railroad. And so as we collect climate variables, data about climate variables, temperature and precipitation and humidity, and today we thought wind we should also collect, because wind was so, I think, you know, it's an important thing, right, that people are doing. And so we thought, that's an important variable. And so what we're doing also is we're going back to the 1850s and the 1860s to collect data from that time period and to then compare. And that data is going to be through dendrochronology. And just today, I got the idea from Adam that we should also look at snail shells. Would not have thought about that. So I've already sent out the email. So the story here of the museum, it's a history museum, you know, and we are to stay in our lane to do history. But what we've understood is that this connection with UT has been very, very, I think, important for us in terms of also being about the moment and about the issues that affect our community. And so I have to say that it is actually what universities should be doing, but universities tend to not do. But Planet Texas, I think, has been a vehicle through which this institution could behave responsibly with the community. And so really, for the first time in like 40 years, I say hats off, you know, to my alma mater. You know, good job. More of this, please.
Oh, hard act to follow. Thank you. Nice. Here's another slide, just to take that in. Okay, there we go. Okay. But I'm Katie Dawson, heading up the end point here. I am, for those of you who don't know me, an associate professor of theater in the College of Fine Arts here at UT. Besides running a graduate program, I also serve as director of something called Drama for Schools, or DFS, because we love a good acronym. And that is an interdisciplinary research initiative that uses the arts to improve engagement, equity, and access in all areas of education. And I have been affiliated with Planet Texas since 2019, and I have led something called Creative Collaborations since 2022. And I kind of love that I'm coming here at the end, because as you think back to everything you just heard from my co-panelists, a number of them mention ways that they brought in storytelling, or literally the arts, photo voice, and other sorts of visual mapping and representation. So you might be saying, why creative collaborations? Why the arts? Or what I do is arts integration in education. Why those things for resilience? I will say gladly and proudly that Planet Texas understands that this climate crisis transcends our ability to imagine its consequences, that the arts become a really powerful tool that you heard spread out amongst a number of the different reportings because it's multimodal, right? We work with our bodies, with our senses, with our visual spaces, lots of different modes to reach lots of different people. You are building sandbags with your body. That is why that memory is so durable. And artist methods inherently broaden the possibilities. They are not constraining, and they're non-reductive, and they attend to both that humanistic, the humanization of research, as well as natural concerns. So those are powerful things, and I just wanted to kind of put that out there at the start of my updates. We, in Creative Collaborations, have many artists working with us, university faculty, graduate students, undergrads here at UT, and also a lot of local partners in arts organizations or individual artists who are eco-artists on their own. So I can't list all of those project updates, but what I want to kind of group them under is 4 big areas. And maybe if your research, as you hear me talk about this, hits one of these areas, let me know. I might have an artist you can partner with. Let's talk. But our artists and working with non-arts folks work in infrastructure questions and research. They work in all areas of education, both in schools and out of school time. They work with scientists directly to improve both of the work that they want to do together. And there's a strong group that is really thinking about our pedagogical, culturally responsive and sustaining practices and performances that center Indigenous knowledge, which is important and crucial to the entire initiative we do in Planet Texas. Specifically, my Drama for Schools program, I'm just going to do a couple of highlights that I'll probably dig into a little bit more later. We've just, we're in the process of completing one sort of iterative cycle around a project that we're calling Creating Resilience with Youth. And this is really for K-12 education. Here, UT faculty and grad students from College of Ed and UT faculty and grad students from Fine Arts work together in our public schools with teachers and students to redesign curriculum using data and methods from Planet Texas to rethink education in K-12 educational contexts. I'm going to hit up 3 of our projects. There are a lot of them in that area. A really initial one, which was done with Adam Rabinowitz over there from some of his support, was thinking about community stories about water and flooding. And that was done in a 7th grade classroom with one teacher looking at some of those ideas. After that, in 2023, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that project got developed, but I want to lift up a particular project in 2023. We worked with a bilingual teacher, 3rd grade teacher at Overton Elementary, and we did a 10-week project there. The teacher did an amazing project focused on researching the impact of plastics from source to landfill. The school is built on a landfill. So kids picked up trash right around their school, and they wanted to know more about where it came from, and they really dug deep into figuring that out using the arts. And then students analyzed that trash, and then they catalyzed research to design art installation projects so they could speak back to their publics, their community about that trash and what they thought about it, single-source plastics. It was really brilliant. In 2024-25 and 25-26, we've been working in our largest scale project. These are 9-month residencies at the Ann Richards School, if you know it in town, a really outstanding secondary school for quote-unquote young women leaders. And that school really holds our student and teacher learning community project. We'll talk more about it in a bit, that brings together middle and high school students, teachers, and administrators to do participatory action research and redesign the entire 7th grade curriculum using data from the city and from Planet Texas to investigate how to make a better possible future for us all. Those students put on a arts festival, the entire 7th grade for the entire 6th grade. 350 kids attended. They engaged in research on the project. It's pretty amazing research. If you want to know more about it, it's really impressive. And then we're taking that work with them and sharing it out at local, national, and international conferences. I will say very proudly, we developed that project in 2024-25. The school repeated it on their own this past fall. That is the gold standard in sustainability for education, is that they do it without you. And they did, because they co-designed it. They knew what they were doing. We got a $100,000 grant last year to replicate and disseminate that model into other middle schools, so we're starting to work on that model now. And that's my report.
Thank you all so much for those wonderful overviews and project updates. And now that you have a general sense of the projects and our speakers, I wanted to offer a little bit more framing for our conversation today and why specifically we're focusing on pivots. But before that, I want to tell you a little bit more about my work and how I sort of came to this idea of the pivots. So I research and make theatrical performances about environmental issues, largely under an approach called ecodramaturgy that has been around for about 15 years. And as part of this work, I've had to learn, become fluent or at least like competent in reading certain the academic languages that we use to describe and interpret climate change and other environmental hazards. And so this is, for example, interpreting what the graphs from the IPCC report mean, just like what are they trying to communicate, which is, I forgot to mention, I was trained in the theater department. So this is well outside my, what my department normally does. And so at the same time, my graduate research was really focused on identifying some of the main cultural approaches to representing or interpreting environmental issues, which the half a sentence version of my research is that eco-theater tends to either conform to sort of environmentalist framings of environmental issues or critique it, sometimes very humorously. And so I've learned to have the fluency in sort of those more techno-scientific languages and those more cultural and artistic expressions. But also, I really believe in working in place and in community. So I've developed a portfolio of community engaged work. This is the latest project we did at the Texas Capitol called The Serpents Fly at Sundown. And so I learned also how to translate or actually not even translate, but like I've learned to work with communities to see what climate change means in their words and in their mental maps, basically. So that project, The Serpent's Fly at Sundown, involved working with elementary school students and teaching them both about animal adaptation to extreme weather, but also like stories of creatures that could shape weather in mythology and religion, and then talking about extreme weather, their experiences of extreme weather in Texas, and then letting them design giant lantern puppets that we then built and that they puppeteer at the Capitol. And so quite a bit of translation going on. And so this is a very specialized and time-consuming but incredibly rewarding task. And this sort of, I use the word fluency because I think it does require sort of translating concepts across different spaces, and sort of my ability to translate is pretty similar to that of my co-panelists in their respective fields. So what is clear to all of us is that all of this technical expertise can be pretty limited if we don't also have the flexibility and the humility to adapt our research in light of new information or added stressors. And so, for example, one of my projects in 2023, which I presented about in 2020 here at the symposium, was a play about trees, bilingual play about trees presented at the Zilker Botanical Garden, that is about a tree that causes a power outage, that happened to be presented the week of the apocalypse here in Texas. So we had to pivot. We had to decide how we were going to adjust the scope of the project and if we were even going to do it. And so it occurred to me that the framing pivots are moments when the sort of academic and intellectual rigor of a project meets the rubber of like your commitment to working with communities. And so it felt like that was an interesting comparative angle across these very rich projects. And then the other sort of perhaps more epistemic, if I can use that word, reason for thinking about pivots is because something that has emerged in my postdoctoral research is that to do work in this climate resilience space is to think about, to work with replicable models or create replicable models that have relevance elsewhere, because that is, expected from academic researchers. You should be contributing to a generalizable body of knowledge, while also working with highly specific data and methodologies that are relevant for your specific context. So there's also, on top of all of that, translation and working with the timelines of the community, we also have to be able to pivot how we work within the sort of space between the generalizable knowledge and the hyper-specific data and context. I think all of this makes sense to all of you who've been here most of the day. So, hence the pivots. And so what I did to plan for this panel is I asked our panelists to come up with stories of times when they had to pivot and that were memorable to them. And so originally I was going to choose one, but the stories were so rich and interesting that I ended up grouping them in 3 different sort of streams, if I may. So one of them is pivots in research planning. The second are pivots in institutional identity, and the last ones are pivots in community interactions. So what proceeds from here is that I've prepared some questions, and our panelists have prepared some very carefully timed answers under these specific streams that I hope are interesting, stimulating to you all. And then in the last 10, 15 minutes, time allowing, we will also have time for questions. So does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to dive into our first question, which is pivots in research planning. So, Catherine and Maggie, could you share some insight into how you and your community's partners have pivoted your planning and or framing of your research?
Sure. Shall I go first?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the setup. So yeah, we had a couple of fun kind of pre-panel. I've never had a pre-panel planning meeting twice. It was amazing. So we had lots of deep conversations about this. So here are some things that kind of rose to the top. For this work I was speaking of earlier in Southeast Texas, that's part of this bigger project, which is called the Southeast Texas Urban Integrated Field Laboratory. And Patrick mentioned it earlier. It's the Department of Energy kind of came out with this call for research proposals, really with a quick turnaround time. And I guess that must have been spring of 2022. Does that sound right, Melanie? Yeah, that sounds right. So thank you, Krista. And it was an amazing opportunity, and we wanted to put it together, quickly, like 5 or 6 weeks, Suzanne. And we decided to go for it. But when Paolo Paslacos, the PI, asked me to participate and lead the piece that it was around kind of the community engaged work, the co-design, we really had conversations about how, kind of structuring the project up front, but not leading with the needed deep community-focused work to kind of create what we would call participatory planning, where community members are involved from the very beginning, even at the proposal stage, for multiple meetings, kind of talking about how we're defining problems, what is needed for the community, how would you frame this, what kind of methods are appropriate, what's the time scale, how should we structure kind of governance and decision-making and power sharing. We didn't have time to do that, so what we did was kind of grappling with this kind of time constraint, and then also the space constraint, which is quite different, because most of the community engaged work I've done is at the very local level, like a neighborhood, not even a whole city level. And this was 5 counties and 2 very different cities. Mm-hmm. So quickly, time compression, kind of figure out a structure that gives space to kind of make space for that trust building and relationship building, or hopefully building on other people's relationships in that area. So that's what we decided to do. And we were so fortunate that one of our community partners is Texas Target Communities, which is a 30-year now going on arm of the planning program in the School of Architecture in Texas A&M. So this is both Texas A&M and UT working together. That has been doing this kind of participatory planning work across Texas, usually in smaller towns, usually in under-resourced communities, for 30 years. So they, kind of brainstorming with their director, Jamie Masterson, we said, let's take your task force model, which is kind of creating the structure for a group of community organization leaders and a structure for a group of technical professionals. We'll probably have 2 of these task forces because there can be power dynamics, right? Mm-hmm. There's eventually one of the representatives on the technical professional task force was in charge of environmental compliance for one of the major refineries. But then we had leaders of environmental justice community, environmental justice organizations on the community leaders task force member. So, sometimes the idea is we meet together, but sometimes we meet apart because maybe there's sensitive conversations. So we kind of create the structure and we put the proposal out there, and we got funded along with these 3 other ones: Chicago, kind of the Tucson to Phoenix corridor, and Baltimore. And then Port Arthur, Beaumont, very justified to do the work there, but also felt like a little bit of a wild card, kind of came out of nowhere. So we got funded and we got to work. And what we did, and I'll wrap up this piece, for the pivot was that we had this task force structure and it allowed us to kind of be regional in this community engaged work. But it wouldn't have worked without kind of already deep established trust networks there from this big team. We're working with 60 researchers from across 5 academic institutions and 2 national labs, and one of them is based there in Beaumont, Lamar University. And Aleve Hasselbach, another quarterback in our lives, amazing environmental engineer at Lamar University, had been working for a while with Paula Pasalacqua on flooding work in the area. So we could build on that relationship with the technical professionals. And then very fortunately, Aleve had someone working in her office, Devon Chagua, who grew up in Port Arthur, literally was the football quarterback, actually, now that I think about it, knew everyone, and was able to connect us to important cultural institutions like churches and community justice organizations and people working in the public sector at the local level there. So that's how we kind of try to ramp up that building of community pretty quickly, not losing the opportunity of the funding, but also trying to be respectful of best practices, kind of like that toggling back and forth.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I joined the team with Frontline Communities Partnerships in 2024 as a part of developing a vision and a scope of work for a huge EPA grant. And developing these EPA grants is like months of work, so many focus groups, meeting with city officials, nonprofit leaders, really getting everyone on the same page about what an appropriate ask for $14.6 million, developed over 3 years at a sprint would be. And we were excited to be taking such a big leap from youth identified priorities. It just felt like such a beautiful project. And my work was looking at 7 public space sites and how design could interface with investment in nature-based infrastructure, shade, places to sit, places to hang out for families to convene, really immersive spaces of nature that the high school students we were working with wanted so passionately. And we spent the summer and part of the fall developing this proposal. We got feedback from the EPA agencies saying, oh, this is such a strong proposal. And then in January, in order to meet this pressure of a 3-year deadline, we needed to have an idea of where this design was going in hand. So I teach community engaged work with my students, and so I started a studio. 13 grad students in January are starting to do a site plan for a 28-acre park. And 2 weeks into the semester, we find out that the EPA program has been canceled indefinitely by the new administration. And we are probably not going to get this funding. And that shift in our expectations and all of the enthusiasm that people had really quickly had to shift towards how are we going to maintain this momentum, knowing that there is absolutely no funding mechanism that's going to replace a $14.6 million grant. And what I love and am so proud of with our coalition-based work is that it actually pushed us back towards that practice of relationship building. And so exactly a year later, we are continuing to have conversations about the park's future, but we're starting to put city officials in much tighter conversation with nonprofit leaders. We're leaning into the frictions and the disagreements about the future rather than a much more opportunistic stance of like, what can we get? What can we do now? To think in a long-term visioning strategy. And I think it's a really powerful way for us to be building these things incrementally and kind of getting back to the core idea of the project, which is that relationship building and the designing of relationships around place long-term.
Thank you both. And what I really liked about both of those stories, especially together, is that both like applying for a grant and not receiving, or like not receiving the grant, can be opportunities to build intentional relationships if the researchers are both, one, transparent with themselves and the community about like what's happening, but also like understand that the relationships are not a tool for the research, rather they happen alongside the research. However, but there are also other moments in framing research where we pivot in framing research that can happen as we iterate on the research. And Katie Dawson has a story about that.
Thank you. Iteration on research for the win. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how Drama for Schools has been iterating. And just to be clear, I think I might have said this earlier, but just to be very clear about this, our whole sort of theory of change in education is that we don't build curriculum for teachers, but we build it with teachers, and now teachers and students together. Because if you do it that way, as we say, when the money goes away, which it always does, or the principal leaves, or this thing happens, then people own it. It's their work, and it's much more likely to happen again. So in 2023, as I said earlier, we piloted some arts-integrated climate literacy projects. And the first time, our first go at this, we were trying to figure it all out. It was very new. So we brought together 2 high school teachers and 3 elementary school teachers who we knew really got arts integration, so that would not be a variable. And we brought them together with Christian and actually quite a few, some of the Frontlines communities folks and some other people from Planet Texas to share their data and methods. And we were trying to figure out like, what could we do together? And those teachers each co-designed with some of our folks a curriculum unit that they would go and lead. And it was interesting, you know, once we got into it, the outputs were super variable. Everyone did their work and it was okay, but whether the principal bought in or not was a huge factor. How much support they felt at their school, their own health at the time, all these kind of factors that impact how we do our work as teachers. And certainly the most effective was that 3rd grade example that I already shared. And I want to lift up some ingredients about that particular example that were so formative to us and how we iterated the next set. And that was this understanding that that 3rd grade teacher over 10 weeks integrated the climate literacy ideas in every subject area. So she was teaching English and math and science and history. Everything was coming through that lens, and it was really brilliant. And more importantly, she was in dialogue in a very transparent way with her recent arrival bilingual 3rd graders at Overton Elementary about everything she was doing as a teacher, getting their feedback, trying it out, and they were evaluating the project with her. It was really powerful and very youth voice driven. So we said, okay, this teacher, these students are teaching us a lot. So we made a pivot. We did a new summer institute, and this time we're like, okay, we're going deep in one school site. And we want to build an institute actually with students and teachers and administrators partnering across every phase of the work. So I'm going to use the rest of my time to show you just a minute and change from a video that we're making, because part of our dissemination is also making sure that the students and teachers' voices are not erased from our dissemination. So we have approval to put them in videos. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of a video that kind of tells the story of this project, just the early part.
And are we okay with audio to play that? Great, awesome. Okay, video in 3, 2, 1.
Hopefully it'll play.
Should I hit play again?
You might have to hop up there and hit. Okay.
In the 2024 to 2025 academic year, Drama for Schools and Planet Texas partnered with the Ann Richards School for Young Women Leaders
a public STEM-focused school in Austin, Texas.
to create the Climate Resilience with Youth project,
The heart of our project was a student-teacher learning community.
who co-designed and led a new climate resilience curriculum for 7th graders.
Students explored environmental concepts across disciplines, combining STEM knowledge with creative thinking to imagine more just and sustainable futures.
Just an amazing collaborative process.
Teachers and students, young people, are brought together as co-equal learning designers, co-equal facilitators.
We worked with people from UT and students as well as teachers.
7th graders, other high schoolers,
UT staff, artists,
Planet Texas, and an entire school.
I really had no idea what I was getting myself into.
We don't normally work with teachers to plan lessons. Mostly the teachers do that by themselves.
Before, I've worked with other teachers on cross-curricular projects, but never in a way that included students as a primary voice.
Being able to work with them was kind of like, oh, like we're all learning together and figuring out how to do this together, and so that was cool.
Yeah? The whole thing is 13 minutes long, so if you want to hear the whole story, hit me up and I'll share it. But we're excited. We're going to be making a whole video series and a website that will disseminate all the curriculum that was built out to other middle schools who want to do the work.
Thank you, Katie. And a question that I think came up for me when I was thinking about these stories that I wanted to post for a short answer is how, if any of you have thoughts on how these pivots in research planning or framing or these sort of built partnerships influence what is researched, like the object of the research or a research question, because that word research, there's a lot of gatekeeping around it, right? And so I'm curious if anybody has thoughts on how those partnerships might change the research itself or the research constructs.
I'll just hop in quickly. Two very concrete ways for the Southeast Texas work I was speaking about was, again, quick proposal writing time, kind of thought, oh, there's a lot of flooding there, there's a lot of air quality challenges, kind of include those in there. But then we figured that, we didn't want to it's always with this work, you don't want to overpromise, right? So we thought we would start with the flooding issue, working with community members, because that seemed to kind of rise to the top originally. But then through meeting quarterly with those two task forces in person in Beaumont, which I actually realized that is like the edge of my community engagement research shed, like my watershed. Like I can drive to Beaumont and back in one day if I have to and be there in person, but also come back to teach at UT. But those in-person meetings really rose to the top. It's like, yes, flooding, of course, but it's just the air quality, the health impacts of the air quality issues are so central. So we pivoted to redefine the co-design work for both, even though it felt like a stretch, but we wanted to give it a try. And then the other fun thing that kind of bubbled to the top of all those conversations was being a bunch of kind of physical planners and engineers who are thinking about kind of physical infrastructure co-design strategies. But then the feedback we got was, no, it's the communication piece that we're really missing too. So we kind of pivoted to broaden research methods around communication outputs. So, I think significantly actually changed the direction of that piece of that overall project.
Thank you. Yeah, and I, part of the reason so those kind of stretches, right, that you're mentioning, or those pivots driven by the community, right, sometimes lead into changes into like how we understand what we do as researchers and what or what our role might be as research. But sometimes those can also like scale up towards how an institution understands who they are and what they do. And that's the second pivot that we're going to be looking at. And so, Francisco, would you like to share some insight about how your relationship with Planet Texas 2050, you already alluded to some of that earlier, but how that relationship has changed, sort of how the museum works?
Yes, thank you. I want to respond to the previous question, and then I'm going to jump into this question on pivots. Museums tend to be bastions of privilege, and the museum where I work is no exception. A museum where I work was founded by Anglo-ranching families. And so the story that was collected and the story that was presented tended to be no malice from anybody, but it was just they were telling their story. And the museum for many years, the museum is now 60 years old, for many years was seen as the Gringo Museum. And that kept a lot of people away from the museum. So we've begun to change, I think, how we collect stories. We are much more inclusive. But when you look at something like this initiative, what this initiative does is that this initiative democratizes the storytelling. Because, Nancy was raised in a colonia outside of Edinburgh, and far. And so Nancy's going to bring people who are telling stories about flooding in the colonia. And so those are stories of a different kind of privilege. And so I think that by virtue of doing this work, I think that, what we're doing in the life cycle of the organization, which is a very important community organization. The museum is an important community organization. And we have to fight to keep it alive. But when something like this presents itself, it gives us permission and an opportunity to expand the voices and to also become much more contemporary. And history museums across the world, when this thing was founded, people began to go to museums on these. And so we have seen, and this is a macro kind of reality, that unless you're the Louvre or the Smithsonian or the Museum of Natural History in New York, unless you're that, the numbers have been going like this since 2008, 2009, across the world, museum going. And so we have to figure out ways to reinvent ourselves. And so this was an opportunity, along with other opportunities, but this was a really important one because now we're going into year 6 and finding new resources. It helps us to stay, I think, viable and to continue to be a mirror through which the community sees itself. And here's the other point, that they're not getting it in the public schools. The 15,000 kids who come to the museum do not study themselves in the schools anymore, nor do they study diversity and inclusion and equity. So who's gonna take that up? That has to be community organizations. I mean, that has to be families. And so we have a responsibility that is even greater because the moment is calling us to be better than. So that's been important in terms of our organizational identity. We were moving in that direction. I've been at the museum only since 2019. But I have seen the writing on the wall for museums. And if I and my organization, my board do not respond, and if we don't seek out partners such as these, then we continue to be vulnerable. So just in terms of the organizational kind of trajectory, that's the story, I think, on some kind of pivot. The other is that, a very specific kind of micro example, and Suzanne was in the room when this happened. I think, Nancy, you were probably in the room, and I think Carrie was also in the room. Do you remember there was this heated debate between a public official and the people from the community? Yeah. Because the public official was spewing out at this one learning exchange that we had, and we call them community learning exchanges, where we bring people together. And we were talking about flooding and those kinds of things. And this one public official was telling the story through a perspective that the community members did not agree with.
Could we hold off on that story? Because we'll come back to it. So community, community interaction pivot. It's a really good one, which is why I saved it to the end.
That's a teaser.
It's a teaser.
It's like your video, Katie.
Thank you, Francisco. It's a little, the drama, exactly. No, thank you, Francisco. And what I love too about what you're bringing up too is that, institutions are, both what an institution is, how it understands itself, but how it functions are determined when an institution is established, but as the circumstances around it change, how the institution functions needs to change. And I love the example you offer from the museum. And there's also been, but that sort of, those partnerships also transform, as we alluded to earlier, the researchers themselves. And Planet Texas 2050 has undergone some of those changes in institutional identity, particularly around working with artists. And so I wanted to invite Katie to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, we're gonna put the lens back on ourselves and talk a little bit about when Planet Texas 2050 was really established through academics across this university applying to bring their papers and their research forward. There were no faculty or staff members on that original group who were from the fine arts. And I will say, to the credit of the folks who put it together in the early years, there was a lot of projects that did bring in the arts. Adam reached out to me and got me involved because we knew each other from somewhere else. Like, there were people who were doing arts-based work, but it wasn't at sort of the top tier of the initiative. And then in 2021, the amazing Dr. Heidi Schmalbach was hired and brought in. Woot, woot. This is going to be a little love letter to you, Heidi. Get ready. That's, good, right? This is your life. But I want to just lift up that Heidi brought interdisciplinary social science background and 15 years as an arts administrator. And if you want to be a really good director of anything at UT, spend 15 years being an arts administrator, because you will earn all the chops that you need. No money, how to deal with a lot of different opinions. That's the artist. So she was hired by that leadership group. They knew that she had the skills that they needed, and she came in. And then I would say the initiative made a pivot. The leadership really said, no, we actually want someone on this leadership team who has an arts background. And I was super lucky to be softly recruited and brought in and was picked. So it's been a great joy and learning opportunity for me. And then Heidi and I very quickly realized we needed someone who really does climate work in the arts. So we brought in Christian, who was a graduate student, PhD student, and said, hey, come and we'll pay you and you work with us too. And so the three of us really took on this task of how do we lift up the arts? And I think this idea of working at the speed of trust, which I think is something that has been mentioned by other folks, is as true with our own organization with each other. We couldn't just say, you get an artist and you get an artist. That wasn't quite our pathway. Instead, we set up workshop times, often out in natural places where artists and scientists could work together, think through ideas. What's the reciprocal change? How do you work? How do I work? Is there a natural fit? Maybe there's not. And, we went through these moves together to really grow from a kind of shared level of expertise. It wasn't extractive of the artist's skill as communicators, and it wasn't shoved on to the folks who hadn't worked with artists before, because neither of those plans really work. And there have been incredible projects, as I said earlier. I want to lift up Forklift Dance Works, their Way of the Water project, which has had funding and worked with a lot of different artists from this initiative. Eco-artist Juliet Whitsett, who you saw in our video, has also worked with a lot of other people all across the initiative. So in a very interesting way, the artists are some of that glue that weaves in and out and through the work. And I also want to say that we've been researching ourselves. There's not very good theorized research around how artists and STEM folk partner together. So we've also been collecting data on what we've done and how it's went, and our missteps and our pivots and our successes. And we're working on a paper on that right now to sort of really understand this mechanism so other universities might emulate what we've done.
Thank you, Katie. Yes, I will hold more thoughts on that because I obviously have a lot. But I will also say that, and a lot of good thoughts about that. For this sort of final stream, I wanted to sort of recognize that some of the science and, shall we say, the arts of working with communities, it works in the sort of long time scales of planning the research, building trust, reassessing how an organization works. But sometimes these happen on our feet. Sometimes there's pivots that we need to do pretty quickly. And so and Francisco was already alluding to one of them, but I wanted to share, sort of make space to talk about pivots on how we interact with communities that arise from added pressure and that in some ways can feel, I think the reason I love this stream, I think, the most is because it really draws on both an application of you really understanding your discipline and why you're doing what you're doing, but also in your people skills and your ability to manage a situation on your feet and really take that humility and ability to reflect, what is the single most important thing here. So, Maggie, and actually, would you like to share a little bit about your experience pivoting?
Yeah. So currently we're working on collecting oral histories as a part of a Monument Lab grant. And these are oral histories taken of community elders and their experiences at the founding of Arise Adelante and their observations of the environmental history of the area. And in our grant application, we had this great idea where we're going to have high school students from the community participate in collecting the oral histories. As we're starting to think through our scheduling, our team is really conscious of the amount of time that we're asking of our community partners, knowing that it's an organization that offers a lot of essential services to the surrounding community, particularly in this time, to be asking them to be doing things that in any way feel frivolous or just for research purposes without that reciprocity that I think a lot of people on the panel today have talked about is a real concern. And so in the planning conversations, we kept saying, you know, is this too much? Should we scale back? Should we just do one weekend? What role feels appropriate for the youth? And it was really inspiring to hear our partners say, actually, can you make it bigger? Can you make this a really meaningful opportunity for the youth to participate in and gain some skills, and from you, maybe test out a career or think about paths through college, and make it a program where they're getting training and they're fully participating in your work. And so we went from an idea of like very surgically having 3 weekends that we're claiming to now doing a 3-month series of workshops with them that's called their Youth Eco Researchers. And they're starting with workshops where they take oral histories around environmental history, and then they're learning about design and participating in design charrettes associated with that history. And then they're doing planning associated with connectivity. And we just did our first workshop this last Saturday. It was 4 hours long, and they were totally right. If we'd done it as 1 hour, they would have been bored. But by hour 4, they were so into it and so excited. And I think it's a reminder to me that there's no way to collaborate in a low impact way. And so we just need to lean into those relationships and recognize that we are going to be disruptive, but do that towards a positive change that's beneficial to everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. And sometimes those collaborations as also, you know, the communities can invite us to sort of lean in more, but sometimes the sort of collaboration brings to the fore tensions, right? In misunderstandings or misalignments about what was previously assumed. And so finally we return to Francisco's story. The drama story.
First, I want to see what's going to happen to those oral histories, because you know, yeah, I mean, we'd love to be the depository of the oral histories. We too have collected oral histories with Arise Muniz, and we've got a couple dozen on natural disasters, and so thank you for doing that work. So our purpose is to preserve and present. It's not to mediate, like this fight, you know, in a community meeting. But I think that mediating and being kind of a, you know, conciliatory and modeling that with a community is always a good thing. And in this particular case, that the story that I began to tell is where we had this community learning exchange, and one city commissioner was presenting, and the community didn't like how he was presenting, and so, as we would say in South Texas, se le echaron encima, you know, like they went after him, and it got very, very heated, and it was such a beautiful moment, and so we had to jump in, you know, and really provide a different kind of, you know, function, which was to mediate a conversation. But I think that in many ways, you know, it is almost like metaphorical how we have to mediate so much as a community organization. In fact, right now we're mediating how we tell history. Yeah, can you imagine the story of the Underground Railroad going through South Texas and into Mexico? And like nobody ever heard that in elementary school. Well, we've gone to the Mexican archives and look at the Mexican archives, like Mexican judges were saying, no, you came for your property, you found your former property that went into Mexico and you're here to claim her and you got a slave catcher with you, and the Mexican judge says, no, she is not your property and we don't extradite. And that story hadn't been told. And so because we're going into the Mexican archives in Matamoros and Reynosa, and we're finding that it's like U.S. historians have been kind of lazy not going into those archives. And so what we're doing is we're finding these stories that are absolutely redemptive, to who we are, and I think uplifting and humane. And so we're mediating history, just like we might mediate this all-out, argument. We're also mediating in much more macro ways. And so I guess the point here is that, we get to this because of the buttons that are being pushed. And the buttons are being pushed because of the initiatives that we're doing. And the initiatives that we're doing is because Suzanne sent an email.
Pull through.
I mean, and she does it. No, I just have to say this. And Suzanne does it with great humility. She's extraordinary and she's so humble. I just wanted to say that, Suzanne, because you are terrific. But so there's a micro point there and there's a macro point there, and both are pivot moments, I think, in a micro and a macro way.
Thank you. Yeah, and once again, going back, like the sort of quick thinking on our feet can happen too, because, tensions arise, or because when projects, are planned and set out, when we apply for funding, there are specific plans that are set forward, and in some ways, like promises too that are made to communities, right? And so Catherine actually has a story about that in terms of like how they're managing extenuating circumstances in the research.
Indeed. I'll keep it short so we have lots of time for conversation and questions, but the Department of Energy apparently has funded these not urban, regular, rural, integrated field laboratories for a long time, which are kind of these centers of integrated environmental science research around, air quality and wind and solar energy and flooding and all these environmental science pieces of the project we're looking at, but they weren't in the context of people in place and community. So the ones that they funded that we were chosen for the urban integrated field laboratories, to my knowledge, is the first time the Department of Energy really made this large investment in environmental justice focused work. I mean, this was a $17.5 million grant. We were the smallest of four, actually. It's a lot of money. And it really was kind of celebrated as this pivot point for DOE, kind of thinking about the importance of their work, environmental work to community. Sure enough, with the shift last year in January, we're kind of just waiting to hear if we're going to lose our funding. We're about, at that point, 2.5 years into the project. And we didn't hear anything all spring, and it felt okay. And then in the summer, we get the call from Paula Paslak, our PI, that eventually caught up with us, that the association of environmental justice words with this project was figured out, and that the Department of Energy was going to close down all 4 labs. And, all of us here have colleagues who've lost research funding or almost gotten research funding and didn't get it over the past year. So I will say at least we had a wind down period. Some people lost their funding that day, and that was it. We had 6 months to kind of figure out what to do to pivot. Working in a community that has often felt, in their own words, just completely ignored by the rest of Texas or even the rest of the U.S. I mean, apparently, like a quarter of the jet fuel that we use in the U.S. comes from this refinery in Beaumont. I mean, they are completely integrated into the economy in the whole country. But, who knows that, right? That's at best. At worst, a complete sacrifice zone, to also use community members' words. So then I have to go back and say, we too are leaving, right? We have lost our funding. It was just such a hard conversation. I felt so much grief around it. But I think, what can we do? So we brainstormed and we came up with, back to this focus on communication, that the most important thing for us to do in that last 6 months was to take all the information, both the local knowledge and scientific data, and figure out how to package it in ways that it was inclusive and could stay there in community and be useful. So that's what we've been doing for 6 months, writing these one-pagers, creating podcasts, telling the story. And the silver lining, I think, that came from that pivot too, was that community members took that kind of co-design framework that we had developed together over the 3 years and found an abandoned golf course in Port Arthur. If you guys ever have a chance to go through there, it's called Pleasure Island, which is like amazing little name. It was a golf course that got wiped out by a hurricane about 15 years ago and is sat there, and now mostly feral pigs live on it. And community members, there's not a lot of green space. And I think this is the power of physical place, that out of all the $17.5 million investment Department of Energy, we still have connections there working with community members in Port Arthur, looking for new funding opportunities to do the co-design of this wild pig haven, Pleasure Island, into green space that's useful for recreation, for connection with nature, for physical activity. So that was the pivot that's still emerging. But I will say it's been hard, right? And I think as a researcher, you are so conscious of like not breaking trust and not overcommitting and not overpromising. And then it's like, oh, yeah. Pivot.
Thank you. And and that's those sort of like pivots and community interactions. Obviously, these three kinds of pivots are interrelated, right? Like we change how we interact with the community because we change how we understand our research, and therefore how we understand ourselves. And so these sort of three framings were not offered as like these are distinct, although there will be a paper that comes out of this panel as part of my postdoc outputs. But it's more, I hope that this discussion has been sort of stimulating for you all as audience members. And so now we turn to questions. Oh my God. And we finished with 2 minutes to spare. Look at us. But yeah, now we are able to turn to questions. Yes?
I'm going to have to excuse myself.
Of course,
I have a flight. But if anybody has a question for me before I leave, I'd love to respond to any question. If not, that I'm okay.
When can we get you back?
Yeah.
Yes, any time. Yes.
Really not busy schedule.
Yeah. Any questions for Francisco before Francisco has to fly away?
I have a very specific question.
Please.
Just wondering if your work, and I love the work that you're doing, looking at sort of the archaeological component of the Underground Railroad. I'm wondering if you're working across the border with Nacimiento de los Negros and their Centro de Cultura for Nacimiento de los Negros. So
yes.
Thank you.
So this is, what is your name?
I'm Tisha.
Tisha. So Tisha's question is a fascinating question because, the community that she mentioned is a community in the state of Coahuila where people there have been practicing Juneteenth for over 100 years. Cool. And these are people who look very Mexican, but a number of enslaved people went there to that community and sort of populated that community, and they're very proud of their ancestry. And so so we have brought people from Nacimiento to our museum, and they've been part of conversations with us because we are adding to our 19th century exhibit or gallery. And so we're telling the story of this very specific story because this is Texas history. And actually one of the people, a woman named Sylvia Hector, who was born in 1807, and Sylvia Hector, you probably know the story of Sylvia Hector. There's a dissertation written on her by Maria Hammock out of the history department here at UT. Cool. And so Sylvia Hector was part of the Austin colony in the 1820s. And she would eventually become free. A man named Weber, a white man, bought her freedom. And in exchange for the freedom, the owner would get 2 babies, a 2-year-old now and a 2-year-old at a future date. And if she didn't give up the 2 2-year-olds, then Weber, who was buying the freedom, would have to give up his property. And so that's Weberville. The property they owned was today Weberville. And so they did not give up the babies, and they packed up and went to South Texas, where they were actually going into Mexico, but they stopped north of the river. And they bought a farm, and they became an outpost on the Underground Railroad. And the reason we know this, not because the family's been telling the story, it's a very stealthy story. But we know this because there was a guy named Rip Ford, John Salmon Ford, who was a celebrated Texas Ranger and a slave catcher and the mayor of Brownsville and a publisher, and kept his memoirs. And he bellyached about the Webers, and he bellyached about the Jacksons, that they were havens for what he called runaway slaves. And so we're working with Matamoros, Reynosa, Nacimiento, and other sources from across La Frontera. to tell the story, and trying to the quantitative data that we have not collected yet will, I think, bring more texture to this narrative. It's a very, very important narrative. And unfortunately, the textbooks are not going to tell this story. So it has to be the museum, or it has to be, community organizations, that then we push ourselves into the public discourse where people will have to listen. But thank you for your question.
Thank you, Francisco.
Yes, Catherine.
So thanks again for the shout out about our work with you. I wanted to reinforce the value of your workshops with just a 1-minute recap of something that happened also at one of the workshops that we attended. Suzanne was there at that one, where we had the county commissioner, and we had all this discussion about what's really important during flooding and hurricanes down in that area. Clint wasn't able to attend then. And he reminded us that, you have to be very creative in South Texas for FEMA, because when a hurricane hits, you have to hit a certain amount of loss before you can get your FEMA funds. And if it hits Houston, no problem, right? Lots of wealthy properties, but down there. So we said, well, what is it that you do down there? And he says, well, we talk about the dunes and rebuilding the dunes. And that really sent us, for our simulations, in a completely different direction with Clint, because we've since done the simulations about, well, how well do the dunes protect South Texas on there? And what would happen if the dunes were to disappear? What happens if ocean levels rise? And the results are, of course, the dunes are valuable. But his comment was, we don't really have any models or simulations. So thanks to all those workshops, we were able to also pivot our own research. But we would have never known to do this were it not for the value of those workshops down there and really getting an in-depth understanding of what was important and what matters to the community from a completely different perspective than what we would normally do, because most of the simulations tend to be done in the Houston area. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Katie.
And thank you, Francisco, for coming up to join us. Thank you so much. We do have a bit more time for other questions or comments. Yes, and Jonathan has a microphone for you.
Thank you. This question's for Katie and Maggie, or anybody, but maybe y'all can be the most insightful. When it comes to youth stories, you mentioned elders and being able to spread their oral stories to youth. Is the opposite true? And especially when it comes to building sustainable futures, how do you most effectively tap into their perspective so that older generations can especially when they're not yet policymakers, but older generations can kind of sympathize and embrace it? Do you have any insights or perspectives on that?
I can tell a short little, this is actually a story that was on my mind when you started your story. This is going to be, I'm going to make a pivot. This is a pivot story. I'm going to name this right now. Many years ago, because I'm fairly old, I started a lot of my graduate research in a Koyukon Athabascan community in the northern interior of Alaska, where I worked for 10 years. I did some of my graduate research where I developed a lot of the methods I do in schools with that community, and I try to name that a lot because I cite them. But an early project I did there was in a high school classroom where we had set up the elders in the community. This is very much a tribal community, very remote, rural community. You got to get in on your snow-go or your dog sled to get to the space, or you fly in. And we'd set up the elders to come in because the young people were going to interview them about oral history stuff. And about a half an hour ahead of time, the kids said, nope, we're tired of listening to the old people. We don't want to talk to them. And it was a really transformative moment for me as a facilitator. Like, this happened very early in my career, way before I went to grad school and other things, where I realized I had not asked those young people if they wanted to do this. I presumed that they wanted to do this. I set that up for them. And it was this really terrible moment, also being a white outside settler, being like, okay, I've set this thing up. They're coming in. I need to be deeply respectful to that. And the kids are like, no, thanks. So it was like this pivot of like trying to figure out with them what to do and how to do it. And one of them eventually, I think I admitted that I'd messed up. That was helpful. And they were like, oh, after a while, they kind of took pity on me. And they were like, okay. I said, well, what if we take the questions that you might ask them, but we then ask you the same thing? So they get to interview you, or we'll interview you, and then we'll edit that together. And that was the pivot we made in that moment. But your question does make me think about kind of, how are we getting youth buy-in if we're asking them to do these bigger projects? And then where are the places they might speak back and forth? And I'll just say one thing, and then I'll turn this to you, Maggie. But, for us, making these projects with Ann Richards, these school-based artifacts, and working in the arts is so beautiful because it is an artifact. It is that mediating tool that Francisco was saying so clearly. So making a VR storytelling of a past, present, and future story about the land that's now Barton Springs area or something else allows the young people to think about those possible futures and also look at really complex history of racism in Barton Springs and who could go to that swim there or not. And then we did a big arts festival as part of the work so that parents and other folks, community folks, Planet Texas folks could come and hear the young people present on their work and teach their work to others. So I think that's a big part of our data, too, is also speaking back to audiences, which might get at a little bit of what you're talking about. But I'll pass it to you, Maggie.
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. Within our project, one of the ideas really is taking the youth perspective as co-researchers and taking seriously the idea of their lived experience as an expertise and a particular perspective that often is not a part of these conversations. In some ways, this is a plug for my field of landscape architecture because I think one of our superpowers is the ability to translate ideas, concerns, questions, scientific information into drawings that then can be built and made real. And so my students, in their exchanges of feedback with high school students, are sitting there and sketching the ideas that they're hearing. So it's a way of really in real time demonstrating, like, we hear you and like we are gonna do something with this information. And I think the process of making something from that conversation, making it visual, using arts-based practices to report back becomes a way of reinforcing the value of their input, and it's not just a sort of pat on the head of like, okay, you participated, that's great. I also think, like, in my experience working with youth, they're not conditioned in the same way as adults to tell you what you want to hear. And so we often get a lot better feedback, and it's true of the project in FAR. The feedback we get from the high school students is super honest. Yep. And they are very blunt about like what they hate, what is not going to work for them. And in the more adult conversations, we get a lot of like, oh, it's great that you're here, and we think. So there is a different kind of value in that those sort of exchanges that I think just giving a little bit of indication that it's not just a performance of listening to them, but it is a real exchange that's going to go places. You can win their trust, and then it's like, it opens up all sorts of windows into what life is like there. It's really powerful.
Yeah. And I would just add onto that as like a super short slice, is that I also think that young people sometimes for the worse, have been used as like mascots for the climate movement a lot, in the environmental movement at large as well, like images of pregnant women and thinking about what's going to happen to the child if there's mercury in the water and things like that. So an area that I'm sort of beginning to look into is sort of like, what are the models for young people to also refuse that responsibility? Because it's not, if you look just in the UN space, like since 1972, there's been declaration after declaration after declaration saying future generations will fix it. So there's a real historical debt across generations, and that's an area that isn't so much what we do right now, but I think it's an under-researched area. Yeah. I think we have time for one or two more questions.
We're ready for a snack and heading home.
We might be, yeah. Tisha?
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks so much. I really, really enjoy the discussion, the discourse here. But I want to piggyback a little bit on what he's describing in terms of the benefit received by the organization, because especially what you just mentioned in terms of, with the youth being seen as mascots, it's almost a data supplier. But what have you seen that the organizations, including the youth themselves, are getting out of this particular experience, so they're not just seen as a data supplier that benefits your particular project or KPI, for example?
Great question, and I feel like there's a lot of really rich answers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I can speak for ourselves. It's something that we're really conscious of, and I think that's where our partner Arise in informing us what sort of structures we're plugging into. We're plugging into existing youth education programming that they have. So it's not an add-on, it's a structure that we're working within that comes from the nonprofit organization. But within that structure, there's a consciousness about how we as folks at a university might be able to speak to applications for college, trainings that would make them good job applicants, those sort of ways that we can structure opportunities that then become something that can be on their resume, or connections to UT. We had a group of 43 high school students from South Texas who had a lot of trouble they couldn't get a tour of the UT campus. And one of their students had worked with us and said to his teacher, I know a couple professors, and so maybe we could try emailing them. They said they would help us. And so we got this email saying, I don't know if you know my student. He says he knows you, but you're in architecture, so that's strange. It was like a very funny set of emails, but we gave them an ad hoc, very honest tour of the campus, and they really resonated with the fact that we were willing to give them time. And I think in some ways it's our ability, especially with my grad students, to have informal conversations with people who are near peers about their journeys. And so we try to fill in as we can, but I think it's always a dance of making sure that we're not being extractive, and it's not just about my project going forward or in service to other agendas. And that's where the multiple voices in the room giving feedback and helping shape something to be a real opportunity becomes really important. I don't think it's something that one person can plan by themselves successfully.
I have one quick little story. Probably should wrap soon, but I will say, just kind of thinking about that relationship between researcher, community members, institutions, and yes, going in, thinking about how to be reciprocal, but also just always knowing it's really easy to fall back into these patterns that we've been socialized to do, right? And in the way that we kind of share knowledge or create knowledge. But something that I found surprising was, I think I was so hyper-focused on, we really don't want to go in there and say, here's all this data, y'all, that it took me a while to hear, hey, we would like to hear more data, please, from community members and institutions. And I think that is actually one of the ways we reciprocate it, was that both like that 60-person team went through how you do community engaged research training with the Texas Target Community Partners we're working with. But the other thing that happened was there was such demand to hear data from the scientists themselves by community members that then they also got to learn about how do you translate this information in a way that's useful. And that, I think, for those quarterly workshops we held, that was kind of the highlight sometimes of those meetings, was this opportunity for community members and institutions to hear specifically, like from Geeta Prasad, here are the downscaled climate projections that I've done to like the acre scale. You can think about looking at my projections, what flooding will be like literally in your neighborhood, 70 years from now. And just the kind of like aha moment in the audience that, sometimes I'm socialized to feel like we're just kind of shoving this stuff at you, but the hunger for it too, and like how do you meet that respectfully? So that was one of the other connection points too.
Very quick addition to that. I love that question so much, and I really appreciate it. One of the things I love about doing work in arts integration is the young people are generally better at it than the adults. So like bringing those strategies in and learning them together, the young people's comfort and getting up in their bodies and doing things more quickly is often greater than some of the adults in the room. And also I think getting adults to take a risk and teach something new in their classroom that might be out of their seats and have different sort of classroom management needs or things sometimes is the thing that is the barrier for the teacher. And when they know that they have a co-conspirator in that class of the young people, or they're teaching it with those young people, it sort of like relieves everyone to be able to say, oh, okay, we're trying this out together. We have such great data of the young people being like, I just didn't think teachers did much. But now I realize they kind of do, right? And like sort of that observation. And also like we tried really hard, much to the bane of the IRB people, that we didn't make a move that the students weren't bought into. So my grad students and I would spend hours planning something that we're like, we're gonna do this. And then we'd let it down and the young people are like, nope, we wanna do this. And we'd be like, great, let's do that, okay? Or sometimes we had to all say no, but it was also because they didn't understand how that schooling part of the curriculum worked. So that sort of shared knowledge, and then the teachers would look to the students and say, should I do this? What do you think about that? What would you advise? And it was just a really amazing opportunity, and it was hard to let that stuff go, but a great learning experience, so.
And on that note, we are at time. And so I just want to thank all of you for coming to the panel, but also I just really want to honor the wisdom and expertise of all of the panelists. Yeah, it's really an honor to be here with you all and with Francisco, who's not with us right now. But yeah, thank you all so much and also for like squeezing slices of so many of the things you know and have experienced into this pretty structured discussion. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all.